welcome and thank you for joining the World Affairs Council of Connecticut to discuss negotiating U.S. policy in the Middle East. Today's structure will kick off with a conversation between Aaron David Miller and Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. And by way of brief introduction, Aaron David Miller is currently a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focusing on U.S. foreign policy. He's also a global affairs analyst for CNN and author of 5 books, including his most recent, The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. Aaron received his PhD in Middle East and U.S. diplomatic history from the University of Michigan. And his career in the State Department spans over 25 years as a historian, analyst, negotiator, and advisor to Republican and Democratic secretaries of state alike. In the course of his career, he helped formulate U.S. policy in the Middle East and the Arab-Israel peace process, most recently as a senior advisor for Arab-Israeli negotiations. We're especially grateful to be joined by Aaron today, as this week marks the 20th anniversary of the 2000 Camp David Summit, during which Aaron served as the State Department's Deputy Middle East Coordinator for Negotiations. And his latest article on this very topic is Lost in the Woods, a Camp David retrospective. We highly recommend it, and we'll add that link in the chat so you can check that out. And Aaron, we're so glad to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us.
No, it's a pleasure. I'm honored to be here, truly.
And started, I'll turn it over to you, Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council.
Thanks so much, Amanda. And Aaron, thanks so much again for joining us. We are so honored to have you with us. I know today we're going to do a little tour of the hotspots around the Middle East, but I want to start by having you sort of set the stage. What is going on today?
I wanted to, thanks, Amanda, first of all, and it's an honor to be here with the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. I wanted to just make 3 or 4 brief points so you'll understand the answers to the questions that you're going to ask. There are 4 points that I've gathered over the course of my 40 or 50 years of working professionally, either as a student or as an analyst or working for the U.S. government on foreign policy issues. Number 1, I've worked and voted for both Republicans and Democrats and have had the honor of serving a half a dozen secretaries of state of both parties. It is my strong conviction that the dividing line for an effective U.S. foreign policy is not between Republican and Democrat, left and right, liberal and conservative. It's between dumb on one hand and smart on the other. And the only thing that matters, frankly, is which side of the line do you want America to be on, the smart side or the dumb side? I have a number of suggestions, which I won't, if asked, I'll identify. That's point number 1. Number 2. I'm actually from a real estate family in Ohio where the rule of thumb is location, location, location. And I would argue to you that in order to understand why America behaves the way they do abroad, you have to understand where we are. We are the only great power in the history of the world sandwiched between 2 non-predatory powers to our north and south, Canada and Mexico, and literally fish to our east and west. What one historian, I wish it had been me, described as our liquid assets. These liquid assets, these 2 oceans, afford us a degree of physical security and detachment unrivaled in the world today. And it explains a lot about the way we behave abroad. Third, our conundrum in the Middle East, because I don't think we have an answer for it, is if we can't transform the region, and I would argue wholeheartedly we cannot, on one hand, and we can't extricate ourselves on the other, then what do we do? And that's the central question, I think, facing Republican, Democratic administrations. What is the right balance between doing too much on one hand and not enough on the other? And finally, my final point, I think the Middle East is losing its centrality, frankly, as a dominant issue in American decision-making, largely for several reasons. Number 1, we're weaning ourselves off of Arab hydrocarbons. And while energy independence may be possible for us, for the United States, we'll still have an interest in the Middle East, in large part because oil trades in a single market. So if you disrupt supplies in country X, it'll have an impact on Y and ultimately on Z, which is the American economy. But I think there's an exhaustion factor. The 2 longest wars in American history in Iraq and Afghanistan, freeing ourselves from Arab hydrocarbons, and a rising China. All of these things, I would argue, combined with the fact that we probably can't fix most of the problems in this region, will over time lead the United States farther east, particularly with respect to a rising China. So with those points in mind, let's get to your questions.
So I wanted to sort of start off in Saudi Arabia because it's oftentimes, very controversial. It's been in the news lately. Can you sort of characterize the current U.S.-Saudi relationship in what we're trying to get, what's going on there?
Yeah, Saudi Arabia is a very important country to the United States. The real question is how important. And having worked for half a dozen administrations, all of which accorded Saudi Arabia an important role, I think it's important to draw a distinction between the Saudis as an important country and the Saudis under the current regime of Mohammed bin Salman as a quote unquote ally of the United States. When I refer to an ally of the United States, I mean three things. I mean where there's a high degree of correlation of our interests, where there's a high degree of correlation of our values, and where in fact you have a country that has a strong base of domestic support. That is, most Americans look at that country favorably. Saudi Arabia doesn't fit any of those interests. We've seen a divergence under Mohammed bin Salman, and particularly under this administration, on the issue of American interests, whether with respect to oil prices, Yemen, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a friend of mine, and a variety of Saudi behaviors in the region that have been quite unproductive. And I think, and again, this is not a partisan comment, it's an observation. This administration, I think, has accorded a margin of maneuver to the Saudis, which have fundamentally, I think, worked to the detriment of American interests. We'll continue to have a relationship because Saudi Arabia, with respect to its natural resource, particularly oil, is of critical importance to global stability as a major oil producer. But I suspect a change in the administration will likely create, if there is a change in the administration, likely create a more perspective and distance in that relationship.
So as a policy advisor, how would you advise an administration on how to deal with Saudi Arabia in light of what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, in light of what's happening in Yemen and in Qatar?
Well, I think you have to take a look at what American interests are and try to determine whether or not, in this particular case, the Saudis are helping us pursue our interests or degrading them. And if you took a look at what I would argue would be the two most important interests that the Saudis claim to want to advance, one is, what are they doing with respect to aiding the administration's campaign of containment of Iran? And second, what are they doing to advance the importance of Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking? I think on the first, I think the Saudis have frankly expanded Iran's opportunities in the region. Yet the Yemen policy has been an abject disaster. It's a war that's exhausting Saudi resources. You have the world's largest humanitarian disaster. And yes, the Iranians and their Houthi colleagues have their own responsibility for contributing to this crisis, but the Saudis don't have a policy in Yemen that is likely to succeed, and we are enabling that policy. On the Arab-Israeli issue, I must say, for reasons that have to do with both Saudi and Israeli interests, naturally, in large part because they're both interested in containing the Iranians, a certain coincidence of interests have emerged between the two. I've seen things with respect to Israel and the Gulf states. The Israeli flag raised in Abu Dhabi, the Israeli national anthem sung at a judo tournament where Israeli athletes are competing. These things are unheard of, quite extraordinary, but they exist not because of the administration's policies so much as a kind of natural coincidence of interest. So there has to be a cost for allies or partners that willfully undermine American interests. And we've imposed absolutely no costs on the Saudis. And I think to some degree, without ruining the relationship, we have to make it clear to them what we will accept and what we won't, and we have not done that.
So let's move to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I know Amanda opened, and we have put a link to your article about the 20th anniversary of those Camp David talks. You've recently written that the annexation sort of consigns a two-state solution to the dustbin of history. Can you sort of explain what you mean by that?
You know, I had a half a dozen meetings with Jared Kushner before he was formulating the Vision for Peace plan. And I said to him when I first met him, I said, you know, I wish my father-in-law had as much confidence in me as your father-in-law has in you, because he's given you mission impossible. And that's really the point of departure. Yes, the US can contribute positively and negatively to a two-state solution, which in my judgment remains the least bad option for resolving what ails Israelis and Palestinians. But the US can't fix this. And that's the real problem. At Camp David, 20 years ago this week, a summit that was ill-advised, ill-prepared, and ill-conceived, the same three problems that dogged the Israeli-Palestinian negotiation then continues to dog them now. Number one, the absence of leaders who are masters of their political houses and who have an urgency to try to address this on both sides. That's number one. Number two, the absence of an agreement that fairly and equitably meets the needs of both Israelis and Palestinians. And finally, you will need a third party. I would argue if the United States, when it knows what it's doing, it can in fact be that third party. But this process has lacked the presence of a willful and skillful mediator for a long, long time. The most effective mediator, most effective negotiator, Secretary of State that I ever worked for was James Baker, who had the confidence of George H.W. Bush. And it was no coincidence that we helped Baker successfully put together the Madrid Peace Conference in October of 1991. That's not to compare a peace conference with an actual agreement, which has to address issues like Jerusalem, which are right now mission impossibles. But the Bush-Baker administration understood how to be willful and skillful. They understood that if you want to broker an Arab-Israeli agreement, nobody was going to plant a tree in your honor, and that you have to essentially apply both honey and vinegar to both parties. We don't have that. We've lost that sense of how to do that, certainly within the last several years.
So I want to remind everyone, if you have a question for Aaron, please use the Q&A. I'm going to bring in an audience question now, sort of about negotiation. So in your experience in negotiations, do you find that the process of negotiation is much more enticing to the parties involved rather than a final agreement? That question
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. Yeah, there's no question that process can actually help one party or another. Because remember, the pursuit of a negotiation can be used for many other purposes other than to reach an agreement. It can be used to marshal public opinion on your side. It can be used to appeal to the United States for additional resources. It could be used to basically as a public relations device. Negotiations, when they succeed, frankly, aren't much different than good marriages, good business propositions, or good friendships. They've got to be based on a balance of interest, an interest that meets the needs of both parties to a negotiation. And one other thing, there's this famous piece of philosophy in the history of the world: nobody ever washed a rental car. It's a profound piece of philosophy, because what it essentially means is that people care only about what they own. And what's critically important in a negotiation is that the parties to that negotiation and to the conflict own the process as their own. It's no coincidence that the great breakthroughs in the Arab-Israeli peace process, Egypt-Israel, Palestinians-Israel, Jordan-Israel, all occurred without exception, without the foreknowledge of the United States. That's ownership. Once that ownership is in place, Washington can, in fact, if it proceeds willfully and skillfully, actually help to broker an agreement. That was Jimmy Carter's experience at the first Camp David in 1978. That was not Bill Clinton's experience, despite the best of intentions, in 2000.
So let's move on to Iran for a minute. So we all remember back to January, which seems like ages ago, there was fears of a hot war sort of erupting between the U.S. and Iran. Where do you see that relationship today? Where does that stand? And do you sense that there might be re-escalation?
I mean, I think there are many potential triggers, and I'm stunned, frankly, over the last decade, that given the arena for potential competition between the United States and Iran and the Israelis and Iran, Syria, Lebanon, the Gulf, cyber, you've read the reports about this recent explosion last week at Natanz, a critically important enrichment facilities for the Iranians. Whether it was done by cyber or whether it was done by direct sabotage, that alone could have triggered a response. But I think what governs, I hate to use this word, the stability in relations between the US and Iran, and even in terms of the relationship between Israel and Iran, is fear of the unknown. It's fear of opening up a box out of which could come some monstrous catastrophe that could actually make things worse. And what we know about, certainly on the American side, what we know about presidents and elections, the last thing any president wants 4 months before an election is a messy, complicated war, which could see a spike in oil prices, a crash of financial markets, and conflict that could result in the deaths of Americans. So I think, at least until now, certainly when it comes to Iran and Israel, both sides, I think, are waiting to see the outcome of results in November. That doesn't mean, however, in the next 100 days, you might not see some escalation.
So a question from the audience. Iran is going to be having their own presidential elections coming up. In your opinion, do you think that Iran will continue to stand by Rouhani, or should we expect some kind of shift in power?
No, I mean, Rouhani's term is done, and I think you will get a new president. I suspect it'll be one of a more conservative bent. But I think the fundamental issue is where is the fulcrum of decision making? It's not in the presidency. It's not in the parliament. It is with the supreme leader, heavily influenced by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. That's where most matters of national decision making will be influenced and shaped. And that's likely to continue as long as the Iranian Islamic Republic continues as an authoritarian repressive regime. It's likely that's where decision-making is going to be found, which, of course, in some respects complicates, but can also simplify decision-making should a opportunity for reaching an agreement with the Iranians emerge.
So, as a seasoned negotiator, do you think that there is hope or the prospect of renegotiating some kind of nuclear agreement or returning to the JCPOA?
I think yes, but I think the sun, the moon, and the stars are going to all have to align in a pretty fortuitous manner. And even then, you have to ask yourself, what is the end state here? I mean, let's be clear. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, was never designed to be a transformative agreement. It was designed essentially to buy the United States time to solve a problem that it had no solution to, which is, what do you do about an Iranian establishment that wants to remain one screwdriver's turn away from developing enough fissile material to make a nuclear weapon? Now, the Iranians have not made a political decision to weaponize, but they clearly have the scientific knowledge. So, I'd have to ask myself the question, an agreement is possible, but I think it's going to have to, much along the lines of the last one, be transactional in nature, not transformational. You're not going to see a situation emerge in which the US-Iran and cross some Rubicon where diplomatic relations, travel, exchange of scientific information, and all of this just flows naturally. That's not the future of this relationship. Certainly as long as you have the kind of regime in Tehran, which is shaped by and large by a profound sense of insecurity on one hand and a profound sense of entitlement on the other. So I think you're going to have to see some sort of negotiated solution, some sort of negotiated framework, not a solution, to manage the nuclear issue because we can't fix it. And without one, I think it's only a matter of time before you actually do have an escalatory cycle that ends up with a much more severe conflict between the United States and Iran, and more likely an escalatory cycle between Israel and the Iranians.
So let's take a step back and look at the region as a whole. So we've talked about Saudi, we've talked about Israel, Palestine, Iran. How critical is this region, and in particular those countries, to national security interests today?
Well, it's a fascinating question, and we had at Carnegie a session several weeks ago called "The World Infected," in which we had the author of The Great Influenza. We had Mike Chertoff, former Homeland Security advisor. And the question is, since 2000, we've invested $60 billion more, probably, if you include the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, all tethered to the notion of stopping a terror attack against the continental United States, which obviously is the most critically important role for any president, how to keep the American people safe and secure. And in the last 20 years, we have seen, since 9/11, one terror attack, one in Pensacola, directed by a foreign terrorist organization that resulted in the deaths of Americans. During that time, we've whistled past the graveyard on the issue of pandemic. We were warned repeatedly by our own intelligence community, including the 2019 National Threat Assessment, that the probability of a viral flu that would kill thousands of Americans and wreak havoc with the US economy was a real possibility. And yet to public health and to pandemic and to the stockpile, how many resources did we devote? We need a new definition of Homeland Security, not just on pandemic, but on climate, as well as other things. When I said the Middle East is decreasing in frequency, I mean in importance, I mean that seriously. We may in fact be attacked at some point by a Middle Eastern terrorist organization. But think about it. That pales by comparison to the damage and the danger that this pandemic has done. It's wrought havoc, it's created an inflection point that will take years, not just for the government and the economy, but for American society to recover. And so I think we need to rethink some of these issues and try to create a sense of priority. I just don't see the Middle East, frankly, particularly as we wean ourselves off of Arab hydrocarbons and the lack of success we've had in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, I divide the Middle East into two kinds of problems: migraine headaches and root canals. And I don't think the US, frankly, has the capacity, the will, or the public support to invest billions of dollars in a region that is broken, angry, and dysfunctional. We should try to play a role where we can. We should identify partners that serve our interests rather than retard them. But I think we really do need to take a step back and try to figure out what is it that we can actually make better and what is critically important to the security of the United States.
So I'm going to bring in a few more audience questions. They're a little bit more specific. So here's a question about Israel. Can you explain some of the reasons for the domestic pushback against annexation, and what are some of the risks to Israel of this policy?
Well, there's literally, if the questioner means domestic Israeli pushback, there really isn't any. I mean, most Israelis either don't care about this in comparison with what they do care about, which is the resurgence of COVID and the prospects of economic recession, or they're prepared to acquiesce in the current Israeli government extending its sovereignty over areas that the Israelis had never planned to return in any event, the Jordan Valley being one, and the settlement blocks very close to Jerusalem being another. Here, the pushback, since Israel is no longer a unifying issue in the American political context, there are at least three different Democratic Party views on Israel and one Republican view, well, maybe two. here the pushback, I think, on the part of progressives and even mainstream Democrats is clear. But even here, given the challenges that we face, which is a kind of super challenge of a 1918, a 1929, and a 1968, 1969 all rolled into one, I'm not sure much beyond the American Jewish community and the evangelical Christian community and activists on both sides. I'm not sure there's a whole lot of public opinion, frankly, that cares about this issue one way or the other.
So the other question, do you care to comment on the U.S.-Saudi arms deal? This very controversial thing that recently happened.
Well, yeah, I'll comment in saying that Saudi Arabia is a partner of the United States. I mean, I think we have an interest in ensuring that the Saudis are somehow protected from external threats. But believe it or not, Saudi Arabia has the fourth largest budget, military budget in the world. They spend more money on weapons than only 3 other countries. And most of those weapons, they will never use, because the threat the Saudis face is not threat from a conventional invasion. The threat they face, frankly, is, in my judgment, the conundrum and contradictions of their own internal politics, the way they relate to their Shia minority community, for example, and how repressive and authoritarian Saudi Arabia has become under Mohammed bin Salman. And I think that to me, it makes little sense to sell the Saudis billions of dollars. I realize it creates American jobs, but from a national security standpoint, it makes little sense to sell the Saudis billions of dollars of sophisticated weapon systems that, frankly, they will never use, nor are they going to be any sort of deterrent, because I don't see the threat, the external threat to Saudi Arabia. Iran is not going to invade Saudi Arabia. What they will do is to use drones or missiles to attack Saudi oil installations, which they did last year, and the Saudis were virtually powerless to defend themselves. Those are the kinds of, that's the kind of military equipment and hardware that the Saudis need, not prestigious aircraft and tanks.
So we're almost out of time, but as we close, I'm going to ask you to sort of give us your best case scenario, looking at the U.S. role in the region, in the Middle East region, and maybe even in the greater world itself. What is your best case scenario for the future?
You know, I am at 71. I am increasingly aware that time is no longer an ally, it's an adversary. And I look at what's happened to America in the last, I don't want to politicize this. Let's just say within the last 5 months. And my real concern has nothing to do with the Middle East. America will be fine. We will struggle. We will add our voices and our influence when we can. Maybe we'll get lucky. You'll get an Arab-Israeli leader at some point who actually wants to make a deal. Maybe the Middle East, you've got 3-4 Arab countries, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, minus Iraq, in relative states of meltdown. We can't fix any of that. Foreign policy begins at home. It begins with a political system that's functional. It moves on to a citizenry that's involved. It gets to the whole issue of, national sacrifice and selflessness. These kinds of values are critically important. And at the risk of politicizing this, I will only say, having worked for Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, and it's not a campaign commercial for anyone, but I will say to you with supreme conviction that if we want out of this mess that we're in, we're going to need a president that understands how to convert the M in me and turn it upside down so it becomes a W in we. All right? That's what America needs. The involvement of citizenry, wise leadership at state, congressional, and at presidential levels. I wrote a book, The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. Forget great. I'm not sure that the American public, divided and polarized as it is, could ever actually support a candidate that would be bipartisan and have the kind of support, even on reflection, that our undeniably greatest presidents have had. But we need good presidents. Good in the sense that they're good at what they do. Good in the sense that they understand moral and ethical parameters. And good in the sense that they have the kind of emotional intelligence required to govern wisely. And I say this not in a partisan sense. I deeply believe in this republic. I've devoted most of my professional life to seeing it succeed. Whether it's at home or abroad, leadership is critically important.
Aaron David Miller, it has been such a pleasure having you today. I hope that we can have you back at some point, in the future. Excellent having you with us today. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Megan, thanks so much. I enjoyed it, and just call. I'll be more than happy to reappear.
Fantastic.
I'll just jump in to say thank you again. Thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you, everyone who's joined us today. And coming up, we have Ambassador Huang Ping, Consul General of China out of New York, joining us. We also have Dr. Richard Haas, President of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee, the Director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. So those are coming up next, and we encourage you to please, if you'd like to get these notifications, as always, please subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch this video, you can revisit this conversation, and also watch the past episodes and all the ones we have coming up. So once again, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in the future. And most of all, thank you so much, Aaron, for a great conversation today.
Amanda, thank you. And to everybody, be safe, be happy, and be well.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.